Welcome to part 4 on how to make the Sabbath a delight. Today we are going to be talking about the celebrating principle, the principle of celebrating the Sabbath. And I just want to start by giving a little credit to one of my sources and encourage you to actually go check this one out. This is on YouTube. Dr. Joanne Davidson has a presentation called The Great Sabbath Welcome. And so some of my stories and examples are going to come from that presentation. So I want to give her credit and encourage you to go watch that because that will be a blessing for you as well. So I want to start off this section by telling you a story. The story comes from Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And it's a story about her grandfather when he was a little boy and how he kept Sunday. So their Sunday began at sunset on Saturday night, and they had to stop all their work, all their play, and supper was very solemn. Afterwards, their father would read a passage from the Bible. They had to sit straight and still in their chairs, and then they all knelt for a very long prayer. When he said amen, they all had to take a candle and just quietly go to bed. They couldn't laugh, they couldn't talk, nothing, just silently go to bed. Sunday morning, they woke up, they'd eat a cold breakfast. They didn't do any cooking on Sunday. And they all dressed in their best, and they started to walk quietly to church. And you must not joke, you must not laugh, or even smile as you were on your way to church. In church, you had to sit on this bench in a row, and it was a hard bench. You had to sit there for 2 hours. You weren't allowed to swing your feet. You couldn't turn your head and look out the window, at the wall, at your friends, anything. You had to keep your eyes on the preacher the whole entire time. Never take your eyes off from him. And then when church was done, you'd walk home very slowly. By now they'd allow you to talk, but you had to talk very quietly. And then they ate a dinner that was prepared the day before, but they didn't believe they could heat it up. It had to be eaten cold. And then in the afternoon, Grandpa and his brothers had to sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism the whole rest of the afternoon until the sun went down. Kind of sounds boring, doesn't it? Sometimes we dread the Sabbath as well, and as the story that she tells, as I'm going to tell you, illustrates. Well, Grandpa and his brothers lived in a home that their home was on the side of a hill. So the home was like in the middle of the hill, and the road ran right from the top to the bottom of the hill, right past their front door. And in the winter, it was perfect for sledding. And one week, Grandpa and his brother James and George were building a sled. Every minute of their free time and playtime they spent building this sled. And it was the best sled they ever made. They could all three sit in a row on it and just ride down the hill on this, and they planned to finish it Saturday afternoon and have some time to ride it before Sunday began. But their father asked them to help with some wood hauling, and that took longer than they expected. And so they only had time to finish this sled and not to ride it, not even once. And so they had to put the sled into the woodshed and wait for Sunday to be over, and it was agonizing. The next day, as they were sitting there in church for 2 hours on that bench at church, all they could think about was that sled. As they're sitting there eating their lunch, and then later sitting there on the bench studying their catechism, all they could think about was that sled. And the sun was out, and it was sparkling on the snow. It was a beautiful day, a perfect day for sledding, and it seemed like Sunday would never end. Well, then suddenly they heard a snore. Their father had fallen asleep. His head was fallen back against the chair. And so James looked at George, and George looked at Grandpa, and they tiptoed out the back door, as this picture illustrates. And their plan was this. They planned to get the sled. They planned to go to the top of the hill, get on, quietly slide down just once, put the sled back, and slip back in and sit on the bench before their father even woke up. And so they all piled on. Grandpa was in back because he was the littlest, and off they went. They were going faster and faster. They were flying downhill, but they couldn't yell. They couldn't make a sound because they had to just silently glide past the house. And the only sound was the sound of the runners whirring on the snow and the wind rushing past. But suddenly there was a great big black pig that stepped out of the woods and stood right in the middle of the road. and the sled was going too fast to stop, and there wasn't time to turn it. And so the sled went right under the hog and picked him up. And with a squeal, it sat on James and kept on squealing all the way down the hill. And as they flashed past the house, they saw their father standing in the doorway, looking at them go by. Well, they couldn't stop till they got to the bottom of the hill. They all piled off. The pig ran away, squealing still. And slowly, solemnly, they walked back up the hill to their father. And I don't need to finish the story for you to know that one by one they were taken into the good old-fashioned woodshed and given a spanking for their disobedience. But you know, sometimes I think we view the Sabbath a little bit like this story illustrates, that it's somber, it's serious, there's no laughter, no joy. You know, the commandment doesn't say remember the Sabbath day to keep it gloomy. Ellen White says this, and I love this, it's in Child Guidance, page 536. She said, Sabbath should be so interesting to our families that its weekly return will be hailed with joy. With joy. That's the intent. So I want to caution you, though, there's danger of two extremes on this principle. One is to take it to the extreme like the story illustrated, where it's all somber, serious, no joy, no fun, no laughter, no smiling, nothing. The other extreme is to say, well, it's supposed to be a day of joy and gladness, and you give yourself permission to do whatever you want, and you forget that it's a holy day. You forget that God has guidelines about what is and isn't appropriate. And so it's important to find the balance between those two extremes that are within God's boundaries of keeping His Sabbath holy. We'll dig into that a little bit more as we go along. I hope you have your Bibles, though. We're going to look at 3 quick verses. We're going to go to Psalms 92 first, and I want you to think about, as we look at these verses, what emotion and tone do these verses about the Sabbath have? What emotion and tone? So Psalms 92 it's titled in my Bible, and I think most Bibles, A Song for the Sabbath Day. So it was written for the Sabbath. And listen to it. It's just 15 verses long. And tell me what the tone is that you think it has. It says it's good to give thanks to the Lord and to sing praises to your name, O Most High, to declare your loving kindness in the morning and your faithfulness every night, on an instrument of 10 strings, on the lute and on the harp, with harmonious sound. For you, Lord, have made me glad through your work. I will triumph in the works of your hands. O Lord, how great are your works! Your thoughts are very deep. A senseless man does not know, nor does a fool understand this. When the wicked spring up like grass, and when all the workers of iniquity flourish, it is that they may be destroyed forever. But you, Lord, are on high forevermore. For behold your enemies, O Lord, for behold your enemies shall perish. All the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. But my horn you have exalted like a wild ox. You have anointed with fresh oil. My eye also has seen my desire on my enemies. My ears hear my desire on the wicked who rise up against me. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those who are planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing, to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. So what emotion and tone do you feel that this chapter brings? I think the tone is joy. There's a lot of joy expressed in this psalm. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, sing praises to your name, O Most High. Sabbath was meant to be a day of joy. I'm just going to briefly refer to our next verse in Isaiah 58. We've looked at this one before, but just verse 13, where it says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable, and shall honor him, not doing your own ways, nor finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words, and it goes on, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. So the purpose in Isaiah 58 then is also to delight in the Lord. It's a delight. That's another term kind of like joy and celebration. That's to be the intent of it. And you notice, though, that there's some things we're told not to do in Isaiah 58 that apparently help us to delight in it. So sometimes just because we're told not to do things on Sabbath doesn't mean that it's something to be dreaded and that that's for our harm or bad. That's for our good, for us to truly find delight and joy in the Sabbath. Our last verse we're going to look at is in Job 38, verses 4 to 7. Job 38, verses 4 to 7, it says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" This is God speaking. "Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." What event is happening there in verse 4? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Sounds like creation, right? So this is talking about creation, and we understand morning stars to more than likely be angels. We see that angels are represented as stars in Revelation 1:20. So the morning stars or the angels are doing what? They're seeing. And what are the sons of God doing? It says they're shouting for joy. It sounds like they are celebrating Earth's birth, the beginning of Earth, creation. So you think about it, Sabbath is basically Earth's birthday celebration. There is a lot to celebrate on the Sabbath. It's interesting, a rabbi once observed, you Seventh-day Adventists keep the Sabbath, and we Jews celebrate the Sabbath. Think about the difference between that, keeping it or celebrating it. And some things that Jews do to celebrate it is on Friday night, they have a special meal to welcome in the Sabbath. The husband will sometimes or frequently read to his wife, maybe from the Song of Solomon or Proverbs 31. And then the wife will read to her husband, something like out of Psalms 112. And they will bless each other with that and celebrate the Sabbath in that way. So I have a question for you to think about too then. Why should we celebrate? Why should we celebrate? Well, I think the first reason is because we need to remember our blessings. So it's interesting, if you look at the 10 Commandments, they're recorded in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. If you look specifically at the Sabbath commandments in those chapters, the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20 celebrates the blessing of creation. The Sabbath commandment in Deuteronomy 5 celebrates the blessing of salvation. And then Isaiah 66 verses 22 and 23 talks about the Sabbath and in heaven and celebrating. So Sabbath is also a reminder of blessings to come. Blessings to come. And I want to show you, swivel the camera over here for you to see. This is something else that the Jews frequently do on Sabbath. They'll frequently have 2 loaves of challah bread. This is the braided type of bread on their tables for Friday night. And this is to symbolize the double portion of manna that God provided for the Israelites. So remember that there was twice as much that he gave them on Fridays, so it would last them for Friday and Sabbath. And then they also frequently will light 2 candles. And those are to symbolize the blessings of creation and redemption, which we see in the 2 Ten Commandments versions as well. So having a special meal, sometimes with these ingredients, is something that they do. So that's one reason that we celebrate, is to remember God's blessings. The second reason we frequently celebrate is simply because joy is important. Think about that. One of the fruits of the Spirit is joy. And so it's who God is to be joyful. In Psalm 16:11 it says, "In your presence is fullness of joy." Just being in God's presence brings joy to us. And Psalms 118:24 says, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." So what an example of just joy. And you think about it, friendships. If all a friend did was complain, it would get pretty old. But friends who talk about great things and the blessings in life, that brings balance to a friendship. And the same thing with the Sabbath and our friendship and our relationship with God. So have you thought about ever what are the barriers to Sabbath being a joy? Because there are many people who are anxiously watching the clock, wanting Sabbath to end so they can finally do what they want to do, what they really want to do. And Sabbath doesn't seem to be much of a joy. What is the main reasons for that? And I'm going to share with you two that I think kind of summarize most of them pretty well. The first one is, I think, legalism. We are following a set of rules. We're very rule driven. I can't do this, and I, all these little details and things. For example, some people might say, I don't get to work on Sabbath, versus I don't get to work on Sabbath. Another example that Joanne Davison illustrates in her presentation. It's partly your attitude. Are you having an attitude of legalism? I have to follow all these rules. Or are you celebrating the fact that you don't have to do certain things and you get to spend that time with God? So legalism can be a barrier to the Sabbath being a joy to us. The second thing that it can be, the second way it can be a barrier to joy is love. Think about this for a minute. It's an unusual one and it sounds strange when you first hear it. But if we love things, other things, more than God, we can't wait for Sabbath to be over to go back to doing those things. So the Bible talks about where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If our treasures are in things that are worldly and in this world, we're not going to find much joy in the Sabbath. But if we find God to be our greatest joy and spending time with Him to be our greatest joy, Sabbath will be more of a joy. So maybe we need to think about weaning ourselves from the world. Maybe we need to follow 1 John 2:15, do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So back to our question we ask every single time, how does celebrating help us delight ourselves in the Lord? Because it's all about that relationship. It's not just delighting in the Sabbath, it's delighting ourselves in the Lord. Well, I think one reason is because we are most godlike when we are expressing praise and joy. Like I mentioned before, it's part of having a healthy relationship to express thanks and praise and affirmation. And it's a chance to praise God, because sometimes our prayers can get pretty focused on give me, and requests. Not that it's bad to ask God for things, but we need to have that balance. So let's talk about some practical tips of ways we can make the Sabbath a delight. These are just a few, there's many. One idea is maybe starting a blessing book that you just add to on Sabbath. So think about the past week. What are some blessings you and your family have experienced this past week? Another way is to maybe make that Friday night meal to welcome in the Sabbath extra special. So like the Jews, they did with the challah bread and maybe grape juice or things like that to make it a special meal. Another idea might be to share words of affirmation and praise and thank each other as a family. Just finding ways to do that, which is another thing that the Jewish people do to each other. And specifically, perhaps laying your hands on your children and giving them a blessing. You see that in the movie Fiddler on the Roof. They're actually singing blessings to each of their children, but it illustrates that point of the blessing and joy in celebrating Sabbath. So to wrap up, I just want to encourage you and challenge you to think about, pray about how you can make the Sabbath a day of celebration and joy, still within the restrictions, if you please, or the recommendations and the guidance that God has given us to keep the day holy, because you will find true joy when you do it that way. And so may you prayerfully explore applying this to your life.